When we talk about sound, what we're really talking about is vibration that is in an audible range. So sound is what we hear, but vibrations can exist that we don't hear, or some people hear them and some people don't. So there is a lot of science showing that vibration influences life, that vibration influences all organisms, and that vibration has very, very specific levels of influence on the human body. One of the places where this is fascinating, there are peer-reviewed articles now about the role of humming and the power of humming to so many applications. For example, when we hum, one of the things they found is that the levels of nitric oxide in the body increase. So nitric oxide is produced largely from the endothelial part of the arteries, released into the arteries to relax blood vessels. And when you relax the blood vessels, you lower the blood pressure, and it's a relaxation response. A lot of babies don't know that science, but they know that if they make certain sounds, and you'll hear, babies will hum to themselves or kids will hum to themselves just because it feels better. And now they're finding that certain vibrations that we make through not just through our vocal cords, but also using the nasal passages to kind of shape those sounds, actually have influence on people who have dementia. They have found that this helps them to alleviate symptoms of dementia when it's done on a regular basis, and can help potentiate the short-term memories that are often lost. So these are examples of the science that's showing that it definitely has an influence on biology. When it comes to the wisdom codes, I think that's important. This ties into the previous question. And I love the ancient languages. I love the sound of Aramaic. And I hesitated a little bit because I didn't want to get too deep, but I will. I'm going to say it this way. One of the interesting things about language is that there is rarely a word-to-word translation for every language. So, for example, in Aramaic, you cannot go through and take each Aramaic symbol and translate it into English, because it doesn't work that way. There are ideas that are formed in the Aramaic language, and then the question is, can we find those ideas or approximate those ideas in English or German or whatever language it is? So this is why I said I think that the meaning is probably what's really key here. The vibration is important, but I think the meaning that we assign to those words probably has the greatest influence. And then the vibration, if in our mind and in our heart, if we know that we're saying, for example, the Aramaic words that have been spoken for 2,500 years, I think there is a feeling that comes with that, saying that we are saying the words that were spoken by those who have come before us, that had that experienced really powerful benefits from those words. And I think there is a psychological and there's an emotional component to that as well. So, but often when we are in need, and most of the time people, when they're saying these things, it's when they're in times of need. There's not a lot of time to sit down and figure all that out. And it's often easier to simply go to the language that's most familiar and immerse ourselves in the meaning and the significance that we give to those words in our own language and our own culture. So I think it's probably everything, but I think that the meaning we give the words, I think, probably has the greatest influence. Another example, in the Navajo Beauty Prayer, which is, it's a prayer I say to myself at least once a day for a lot of reasons. But the original Navajo, it's a very lengthy prayer, and the Navajo is a vowel-based language as well. And those words sometimes sound strange to us. So rather than get caught up in the strangeness of the sound, if we can simply recite the abbreviated version, the beauty that I live with, the beauty that I live by, the beauty upon which I base my life, and what each of those means, the fact that the beauty already exists, it's our job to seek it out, our job to find it, and to allow the beauty to take on a deeper significance in our lives, to become a foundation or a cornerstone, a filter through which we interpret everything that's coming, that's incoming. If we can do that, I think that may be more useful than getting hung up on the pronunciation of the original Navajo and the uniqueness of the words. And that can be a whole course of, I mean, it can be, you can spend days and days and days perfecting the sounds to mimic those exact Navajo words. And that can be a powerful healing unto itself. So I think that's kind of where the science is on it. And I'd recommend for people to experiment because we're all so very different. So let me just say a couple of words about the DNA first. And one of the fascinating things about the relatively new science of epigenetics. So we've always had epigenetics, we just didn't have a name for it because we've always had the ability to change ourselves through the choices that we make in our lives. That's what epigenetics is all about. But what the science is now showing is really interesting. And let me just describe it in this way. The DNA in the cells of our bodies doesn't change much over our lifetimes. That DNA is held in a wrapper. It's in a container that is of proteins that are called chondroitin. So the DNA is wrapped in this protein. And this is where it gets really interesting because the way that the wrapping happens around the DNA determines to what degree the DNA can express. When the chondroitin wrapping is really tight, it's hard for the DNA to express itself fully. It's called spooling is the term that's used in biology. So the chondroitin determines how the DNA spools or unspools. This is where the epigenetics comes in because our thoughts, feelings, emotions, belief, our breath, nutrition, supplements, environment, they're not affecting the DNA, they're affecting the chondroitin that allows the DNA to express. And where this gets really interesting is that scientists also find that trauma is held in the body in this chondroitin, and it can be passed from one generation to the next. Intergenerational trauma. If your parents lived in fear for their lives, then that biology and their chondroitin is going to be passed to the next generation, and you may have a tendency to have that chondroitin tightened because you inherited that from your parents, but the choices you make in your life can begin to free and allow that DNA to express to a greater degree, and you become healthier and you heal that generational hurt, you heal that generational trauma. So with that understanding, it is the universal language that you're talking about, I think, is the language that we would call love. Science would define the frequency of love as 0.1 hertz. And the reason for that is because 0.1 hertz is the optimum frequency that harmonizes our body, and it harmonizes our body with the magnetic field of the earth. So when we're creating 0.1 hertz, that is an epigenetic experience that allows us to optimize our body. It allows that DNA, the chondroitin, to loosen and allow the DNA to express and spool more efficiently. And we feel better, we're healthier, we're happier, we have a greater sense of well-being. So I think that the universal language that you're talking about is what we call love. The problem is love means something different to everyone. Everyone has a different idea of what love really is. So this is where the science comes in. If you can create the feeling in your body that sends zero point 0.1 hertz from your heart to your brain, that is an optimum form of love for your body. And if music can do that, and for some people, what sounds good to them doesn't sound good to another person, because it depends on their emotional state and what's happening in their lives. If they're happy or they're sad, or if they're depressed or if they're elated, they're going to hear that music differently. So it just depends on the filters. But if that music, if that vibration can trigger the zero point 0.1 hertz between the heart and the brain, we are loving ourselves. That love is going to be expressed as optimized DNA and optimized genetic expression. And we're going to notice that because we're just going to be healthier and feel better. So it's a long answer to a short question, but I don't know if that helps. Does that help? What that is, that liberation that you're talking about is the optimization of our biology. When we are freeing ourselves to be the best version of ourselves. So in shamanic practices, this is achieved through breath. It's achieved through sound. A lot of times plant medicine is used to break through barriers to help achieve these kinds of things as well. So there are many, many different indigenous traditions that use this principle. They don't talk about it in terms of science. They'll talk about it, in terms of a spirit, changing a spirit in the body or freeing a spirit in the body or something like that. But this is where it's so interesting to me because science is so new. It's only about 300 years old. And the indigenous traditions are thousands of years old. Science and the scientists that I know have a tendency to discount the indigenous wisdom. They'll say, well, it's not science. If they would open their hearts and their minds and work with the indigenous people, the science tells us how it works, but the indigenous people tell us what to do to get it to work. And if you bring those two together, I think there's some very, very beautiful, beautiful things that can come from that for scientists who are open-minded enough to allow that collaboration. There's nothing wrong with reading them. And sometimes, I think it's more about the feeling that we have from the codes. I read them. The beauty prayer I say every day, so I have it from memory. But some of the Sanskrit is very complex, and it's not my native language. And I do read them. And it's very effective for me to read them when I do. So I think it's what works for an individual. What I've found when I keep pointing over here because I've got the book. So this is the paperback. That's why I keep pointing over there. What I found is that very few people read the entire book cover to cover. What most people will do is they'll zero in on a part of the book that applies to something happening in their lives, and they'll find a particular code or maybe two wisdom codes that are especially meaningful to them, and that's all they'll ever use. And so they will, by repetition, they will memorize them just from habit. But I wouldn't get hung up on whether or not you have to memorize them or read them. I think it's important. It's the feeling. Because the feeling they're triggering in the body, because the feeling is the epigenetic trigger that's bringing about the biological and the psychological and the emotional shift in the body. So maybe read them until you're familiar with them, and one of these days you'll say, wow, I don't need to read them anymore. Emotional lubricant that allows us to move that emotion in our body. And by repeating the code again, and again, and again, and again, it gave my body permission to allow those emotions to move, whatever it was, whether it was fear or loss or sadness. And, it's interesting because I just had the 1-year anniversary of my mother's passing, and it was more difficult than when she passed. And I think part of that was because I was so busy arranging the service, calling the friends, and getting it all together. That was a diversion, a distraction. And I've often heard it say from grief counselors that the 1 year anniversary can be more difficult. And I wasn't even thinking about it. And all of a sudden, I woke up one morning and I wasn't crying, I was sobbing. I mean, just deep gasps, sob, where you have to catch your breath in between. And I thought, man, what's going on? And it was the 1 year anniversary. And I thought, wow, how interesting. And it's the wisdom codes for loss. To me, when you repeat them again and again, what you're doing is you're acknowledging rather than denying the loss. And in that acknowledgement, you're opening the pathways that allow the chemistry of the body to metabolize. So when we feel loss, for example, they're literally neuropeptides is what they're called. The neuropeptides in the body have to metabolize. And by reciting those codes, you're opening the pathways for the neuropeptides to metabolize through perspiration, tears, saliva. You have a metallic taste in your mouth sometimes, urine, many different ways that these things can metabolize out of the body. And the wisdom codes help to do that. So that I wasn't going to go into that detail, but I wanted to give you a specific example of how I think they help. And for me, reciting them multiple times really, and doing so in privacy. I'm blessed to live in a rural area, so I can go into nature and a walk and not have to worry about traffic and cars and traffic lights. I could just walk and allow my heart and my mind to go where they need to go as I'm reciting the wisdom codes. And it's one of the places where the language can make a difference for this reason. First of all, it's a patriarchal society that those codes came from, and I think we all know that. However, the Aramaic language is one of the most balanced languages in terms of masculine and feminine. So, for example, the Lord's Prayer, in the traditional English translation, begins by saying, "Our Father who art in heaven." Very common translation in English. Right there, look at what's happened. You've just identified it's all masculine, number one. And number two, that masculine power isn't even here. It's somewhere else, in heaven. It's not even here. Whereas, Abun Debash Maya, the Aramaic for the first sentence of the Lord's Prayer, translates very differently, begins by saying Mother, Father, God, or it can be Mother, Father, Birther of the cosmos. That is a valid translation in Aramaic. And it goes on from there. And this is a beautiful example of where there is no word-to-word translation from the ancient into the modern languages and the Romance languages. Our languages are based in separation. So the English language is all about here and there, and then and now, and you and me, and past and future. Whereas many of the indigenous languages, the Hopi language, I talk about that in the book, the Hopi language is based in the Hopi language. Everything is alive and it is present in this moment. The Hopi have no words for the future and the past because everything is living and now. And they are also much more balanced in the masculine and feminine. And the same with Aramaic. So this is one of the places where the meaning can be, of the actual words, can be very, very powerful in the original, if you want to go into the translations in the original language. So I totally get, where that's coming from. Now the flip side of this is in the Gnostic and the early Hebrew, and then subsequently the Christian traditions that came later. When they talk about our relationship to the cosmos, they're very clear that the feminine is the earth and the masculine is heaven, and that we are the marriage of those two. And that for that reason, they don't assign the feminine principles to the heaven, and they don't assign the masculine to the earth. So it's a really interesting perspective that we are the union of heaven and earth. We are spirit and material made from the elements of this world, woven together into this mysterious hybrid essence of our being. So it's not that they're denying the feminine, it's that they are relating to the masculine and the feminine in a very, very different way. Now, to the modern world, there's a big charge on that, and many people feel that it's sexist. And I can see where that perspective would come based on modern interpretations and the charge that is in our societies right now. It's a tremendous charge on these ideas. So I'm going to invite people, I acknowledge that, and it's completely valid. But if we get hung up in that charge, we fall into the ancient trap that keeps us separated from one another and from the deep truth of the wisdom that's in these codes. So if we can I have to do this myself. And the language is, cut the guys some slack, okay? Cut the ancients some slack. And yes, it's polarized masculine, feminine, but what were they trying to say to us? What were they trying to tell us? What wisdom did they know 2,500 years ago that they're trying to convey in these languages based in separation? And how can that wisdom help me today? How can it help me to be a better person? How can it help me to be more present for my loved ones, for my family, for my community? And I try to do it from that perspective so I don't get caught into that ancient trap, because I'm right there with everyone else, and we live in the modern world and we're all caught up in these in the power of the words. That when we understand energy, it's less about combating and more about transmuting. And what we're transmuting is what comes to us. And as we transmute what comes to us, it can influence those around us. But the key is to allow that to happen without imposing our will. And there's a whole conversation about this. Control, manipulation, imposing the will. And where we find our greatest levels of mastery is if we feel that someone is trying to do that with us, they are imposing their will, they are manipulating, they are attempting to control. And the elevated way to address that is to transmute what's coming to us rather than combat what someone else is offering to us. Now, when that happens, sometimes we know where it's coming from, sometimes we don't. If we know where it's coming from, it's not uncommon to see a shift in that person as what they are sending, the anger, or I'll say that the anger that they are sending to us is transmuted within us. They may be changed in the presence of that transmutation. Ultimately, where this comes from, there's a lot of hurt in the world right now, and I think we all know that. And we've all experienced hurt. The key is that the hurt is unresolved. So there's a lot of unresolved hurt in the world right now for a lot of reasons. It's being perpetuated through media, through narratives to separate people. So there's a lot of unresolved hurt. When the hurt is not resolved, it can become fear. And that fear is expressed outwardly as anger and hate. So when we feel that we're being attacked by someone, or I've experienced this myself as well, a lot of times through media and interviews, live interviews. What we have to know is that we're in the presence of someone who is deeply hurt and is not able to transcend that hurt. And it's an opportunity for us to demonstrate the mastery that we claim in our hearts. As we can transmute that anger or that fear that ultimately is their hurt, as we can transmute that within ourselves, you will often see a shift, a direct shift in that person because there's a healing that's happening, but it's not something that we are making happen. It's something that we're choosing for ourselves. And because we are connected deeply in so many ways in this world, the change that we choose for ourselves is also benefiting someone else. So it's very deep, very complex. It's a good question, and I hope that helps to answer. I want to honor our time here today, so I can't really go any deeper than that.